Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where you'll be introduced to insights, tools, and strategies to leverage creative living and giving. I'm your host, Donna Kim-Brand, creative brain trainer and legacy strategy coach. I help changemakers and later career professionals who are deciding what's next to find out what will thrill you and fulfill you, adding meaningful value in your next stage of life. The guests and show content I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So, get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, today I'm going to try something a little bit off the beaten track. I'm going to have a little discussion with you about what do elephants teach us about life after a prison term. Okay, you'll soon see why this all fits into game changer thinking and living legacy leadership. You probably know the stories from people who've gone to elephant sanctuaries. At least these are elephants in a kind of captivity, even though it's in wildlife. But you've heard the story that maybe with just a very thin rope or small chain around their ankle of a couple of feet long, the elephants tend to stay in place. They don't wander off. They don't break the rope or the chain and try to escape. They just sort of stand around there being quite docile, which is quite the antithesis of what we know of elephants out in the wild. I mean, you've probably seen wildlife shows or movies with stampedes of elephants, running at high speed, crashing down trees and so on. So the question is, why on earth, literally, do they just stand in place, don't pull against this rope or this chain and try to, seek a bigger playground for themselves when they're in captivity? Well, what we're going to find out is that just like humans, these elephants, if they are exposed at an early age to this limitation, small though it is, it's enough to train or entrain into the neural pathways, the brain of the elephant, that it's no use to fight against this rope or this chain because they can't break it, they can't escape it. And so they just sort of accept that that's the limitation that life has presented to them. And what we're going to find out here is that it's very much the same for humans. That we who are subject to early conditioning, all of us, in one way or another, are, bred into or have experience that teaches us mentally and even neurologically in terms of how our brain is wired to just assume that this is the way life is. Now, it's worse in the case where a young person, and we're going to switch over here to humans at this point, where a young person is exposed to things like trauma, abuse, extended poverty or starvation, and so on. And it literally impacts and fires our neurons and our brain cells in such a way that the circuits are fried, the circuits are wired to respond in a kind of conditioned way, which doesn't always serve that young person as they grow up. Now, my normal constituent of people that I work with is not prisoners. But when I was living in England, I did have one chance to, as they say, do a prison job. I was hired in, having done a fair amount of work in England with a couple of police services, as they call them. They don't call them police force, it's a police service. I worked with a probation organization, the staff who deal with prisoners and so on, and they were very impressed with what my approaches were able to bring to their staff. And so they thought they would bring me along to this prison because they had a tough government initiative to try to reduce recidivism. Now, what's recidivism? It's normally applied to prisoners, but it's really any case where there's a tendency to relapse into a previous condition or mode of behavior. Now, just to set the tone here, 1/2 of the world's 9 million or more prison population is made up of, sad to say, mostly Americans, also Chinese and Russians. In the U.S., the figure is nearly 1,000 for every 100,000 people in our population. Here are the further scary statistics. Within 3 years of release, around 2/3, that's 68%, of released prisoners are arrested again. Within 5 years of release, around 3/4, or over 77%, are rearrested. And within 9 years, 88% of previous prisoners end up rearrested and back in prison. So what the heck is going on here? Why, when they have a chance at freedom, at life outside of prison, is there this boomerang effect that drags people back into a life in prison, a life of incarceration? Now, there's a fallacy that time in prison leads to rehabilitation. And, there's this whole argument over, is prison supposed to be designed for punishment or rehabilitation? And the statistics aren't good. Now, we're talking here mostly about criminals who've been arrested for crimes of property, normally theft and burglary and that kind of thing, vandalism or worse, but fueled primarily because of drugs. And so the property crime and drugs are the two main crime groups that we're looking at here. In terms of murder, because some people aren't released, they figure a little bit differently, but we're looking at primarily this type. Now, there are programs, obviously, in prisons already, some of them where they just throw money at the situation. We've seen plenty of movies where the guards and the people who work in prisons, some are very dedicated and get along well with the inmates, but others are pretty cruel and mean and, aren't happy in their jobs. And so you have to wonder what kind of influence that is on, somebody who's boarded up in a cell all day and then being treated meanly and fed poorly, despite the fact that we pay a huge amount as, something like $1,000 per year per customer we taxpayers are footing the bill for. So, to think that there's such lack and deprivation at that cost is pretty shocking. Now, looking at programs, what keys they say statistically lead to success is where there's a proven evidence-based approach, mostly where they're trying to address the factors leading to what originally caused them to become criminal in the first place. Number 2 factor for success is that it's cost-effective. I'm not quite sure how that all fits in because it looks like it's from a government perspective. This is from a government report. And then number 3, they tend to have success when they focus on the people with the highest risk and the highest need. These are the inmates. Now, whether that just prolongs the return or not into prison or not, I don't know. Now, if we look at the significant criminal risk factors, 8 of them are identified. One of them is antisocial behavior. This is the inability to avoid criminal activity when placed in high-risk situations. And again, think back to these people who've been conditioned from an early age that this is how life is, or that their brains have been short-circuited because of trauma or abuse or significant poverty, starvation, or other tragedy. A second significant criminal risk factor is antisocial personality. It's where they display impulsive, exploitative, aggressive, or manipulative behavior. A third risk factor, criminal thinking, attitudes, values, and beliefs that can lead to crime. And by the way, this is the one that's often reinforced in prison, not rehabilitated, but reinforced. Antisocial relationships, which are associations with other criminal actors and isolation from non-criminal actors. And a kind of self-defeating vicious cycle there. Family and marital status. Now, this is born out in poor relationships with the family and very often a spouse or significant other. And there's some, with Father's Day having just passed here, there were some significant studies out about the deficit in children's lives, particularly young men, when there are absentee father figures. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. School and work status, when they have low performance, low involvement, and lack of satisfaction with their school and their work. And some of these, of course, are habits that are picked up early, or a self-belief that they're stupid or ignorant or unable, and just a lack of exposure, really, to opportunities that would allow them to think otherwise. Leisure and recreational activities, that's a risk factor in the sense of low involvement or satisfaction with activities that are not associated with criminal involvement. And this is where so many of the programs that, in fact, are effective have to do with physical exercise, team sports, and you'll find a lot of professional athletes become role models for young people in order to stave off these criminal risk factors. And then the fourth one is substance use, problems with alcohol and or other drugs. Of course, we know there's currently an opioid epidemic, and it just seems to breed and feed on itself rather than disappear. Now, the programs that tend to address these deal with, for better or worse, by the way, deal with academics, with cognitive behavior therapy, with employment preparation, career and technical education, and drug or substance use treatment. My opportunity to work in this prison was when I was living in England in the early 2000s. As I said, I was brought in by the head of the probation service with whom I'd worked with her people. And sadly, Wellingborough Prison, or sadly, I don't know, it's closed now. I don't know why. I don't know that it was a downturn in numbers of prisoners. I think it just had outlived its usefulness in terms of upkeep. But I still, when I think of that experience going in that one day, it was actually half a day I was there, about a 3.5-hour program. And I still, when I think of it, can hear the clanging of the metal doors as I walked from the entrance past security through probably about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 metal doors, and my feet echoing in the hallway with the person guiding me through. Very spooky, very scary. I was led into the library, which they had there. And the library had about a 30-foot wall open on one side. And so we were in the gathering space where, you could, we were up in the area of the window. And we had probably about 24 men of all ages, all of whom were due out of prison in 3 to 6 months. And so I was brought in to help reduce recidivism. In other words, set them up for success so that they'd be much less likely to reoffend. And so in thinking about this from a psychological perspective, from a neurological perspective, and I am not trained in deep psychological deprivation issues as a psychotherapist or anything like that. I'm an educator. So obviously I came in with shortcomings, but I did have some ideas, and I decided to entitle my presentation with them that morning, "Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?" Now, at the time, that show was new on TV. It was very popular in England, and it met with a lot of pushback. There were people that were saying, well, that might send the wrong message about life after prison, that they're going to get out and everything's going to be cushy. Or, even worse, it might stimulate an interest to return to criminal behavior in order to pocket those millions. And so I did have to think long and hard, would I keep that as a title? And I decided I would keep it, partly because it speaks